So, you're new to the world of theatrical weapons and stage combat, and you are totally confused about all the lingo and terminology. I get it, I was there too. You're thinking to yourself, what's a broadsword? How small does a sword have to be a small sword? What's a single sword? Aren't all swords singled? Can swords get married? If I love my sword enough, do I have to put a ring guard on it? Hi, this is Sellsword Arts, and today we are talking about weapon types. So before we get started, I want to give you a brief and not at all comprehensive history of Western swords. And the reason it is Western swords as opposed to Eastern or Middle Eastern or African or any other culture is because that is where the majority of my experience lies. And from my experience, if you are in a Western country and viewing this, the majority of your beginner experience is going to be with these weapons. Here we go. We pick up our story already in progress with the arming sword, a short, broad, double-edged weapon usually used in combat with a shield. As smithing technology progressed, this was lengthened and lightened to become the longsword. The longsword was longer, lighter, and more maneuverable, which made it extremely effective against opponents in cloth, leather, or even mail armor. However, due to advancements in armor on the battlefield, it became less reliable, needing to be reinforced and struck into the joints and weak spots of the armor. As the longsword began to be used more for civilian personal defense, the emphasis on the thrust over the cut began to narrow and lighten the blade. Eventually, guards and rings were added to the crossguard to protect the fingers, and this led to the creation of the rapier. The rapier continued to shrink, emphasizing the thrust over the cut. It became the sport of gentlemen at fencing salons. As this happened, they dropped the cutting edge altogether and created the small sword, essentially a giant needle. At the same time, this left a gap in the military that was picked up by sabers, which evolved from Polish counters with scimitars and other curved Ottoman weapons. I'd like to take a moment to thank fencing master Mark Wickersham of Five Rings Fencing for helping me out with some of the historical tidbits that you've enjoyed today in this video. So with all the boring history out of the way, let's start talking about categories of weapons, starting with unarmed, which technically isn't a weapon, unless you're awesome. Unarmed is simultaneously the widest and narrowest category on this list. Unlike other weapons on this list, there are no variations. There is only a fist, a foot, and other body parts. They don't come in different varieties. However, there are infinite styles of martial arts out there. So you can fight in different ways, but you'll always be using the same tools. The SAFD and most other organizations generally teach a baseline based on Western martial arts such as boxing and kickboxing and wrestling, but that doesn't mean that you can't add things like taekwondo, kung fu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and other flair to your variety of unarmed combat. This is a quarterstaff. It is a big stick. Every culture in the world has some version of this, so just like with unarmed, there are infinite style variations on how you can use this. This category also includes spears, and possibly halberds depending on how you're using them, or other type of tipped or adorned sticks. Sometimes this is called a staff, sometimes it's called a bow staff, a quarterstaff. There are many names for this, as many names as there are different languages in the world. Very broad category. The next category is knife, and this is another very broad category because every culture in the world has a knife that belongs to them. The SAFD generally teaches with a knife like this, either a Bowie style or K-bar style curved knife or a double-sided dagger style knife, but there are infinite different variations from karambit to stiletto to pocket knife to things that I don't even know about, and they can all be applied. Even a shard of glass can be used as a knife. The other thing to remember about knife, it is probably the most relatable outside of possibly unarmed to an audience. Because unlike things that we're going to talk about later, swords, etc., this is something that they probably own. Maybe not this one, but a kitchen knife. And I guarantee most people have cut themselves with a knife. So they are going to respect it a lot more and fear it a lot more than they would some big monstrosity that you're going to swing around on stage. Next on the list is sword and shield. So earlier I called this an arming sword, and that is correct. It fits into the category of sword and shield. So you can take this sword and a heater shield like this, and you can do a fight the same moveset that you would do a fight for Gladius and a Roman shield, or Viking accoutrement, or something from a different culture, like Asia or Africa or something like that. It would have to be changed a little bit so it fit the flavor of the style, but it's the same moveset. We're going to talk about this more later because it's an important point and the reason I made this video. The next category is broadsword, and it's kind of why I made this video because there's a lot of confusion around this term. This is a longsword, but it falls into the category of broadsword because it is a double-handed, bladed weapon. A bokken or katana would also fall into this category because it is a two-handed, usually, bladed weapon. So would a lightsaber. Two hands, depending on the lightsaber, bladed. So when we say broadsword, we're not talking about a specific sword, we're talking about a category of swords. I see a lot of people get mad when they say, oh, I'm going to do broadsword class, and then they see these because these are long swords. So we want to remember that historically these are long swords, that's what they're called, that's the correct term for this sword, but it falls into the category of broadsword because the movesets for theater are going to be roughly the same as the ones for those other weapons. The next category is rapier and dagger, and this is where we see a slight narrowing of what is possible. With the other categories, you had different weapons you could use from different cultures, such as katana, longsword, lightsaber, or even from sword and shield, we had things and offerings from all kinds of different countries. With knife, the numberings are numerous. With rapier and dagger, this is really a Western weapon, and it's in a certain time period as well. It doesn't go outside of that time period. There's differences in the length and width of the weapon, but it's really only going to be applicable to a rapier and a dagger. The next category is small sword, and it is the narrowest category. This weapon really only existed for a certain amount of time in a certain place. There weren't a lot of other cultures that had anything that similar to this, and because of that, while there are different styles of small sword, it doesn't have as many options. There's different blade lengths, some blade thicknesses, all kinds of different guards, but a small sword is a small sword, and those moves are only going to work for a small sword. The last category is single sword, and it is a much wider category than the last few we've talked about. Single sword, like the broadsword category, doesn't describe a specific sword, it describes a category of swords. There isn't a historical single sword. There is a theatrical one. This was used on the stage and then famously on the silver screen by people like Errol Flynn, Danny Kaye, and Basil Rathbone, but its moveset can be transferred in theater to a many variety of other weapons, such as its historical roots, the saber, messers, cutlasses, lightsabers that are small enough to be held in one hand. The list goes on. Many different cultures have weapons that work in this category. I just don't have them here. So this is a wide category. It helps if whatever you're using can move quickly because this category tends to be flashier than the other categories, hence the silver screen. And that does it for today's video on theatrical weapon categories. Please remember that these are based off of the Society of American Fight Directors definitions and terminology. Remember, though, that many other organizations also use this terminology as well. Thank you! I need to buy more command hooks. It's really bothering. It's uneven. Look, it's right there. I've got the sword too. Look, just send me command hooks!